Welcome to another Farbank Fly Fishing School episode. This episode is the first in a two-part mini-series that focuses on one of my all-time favorite ways to fly fish for trout in a river, something simply called Trout Spey. Trout Spey has rapidly gained popularity in the river trout world in the US, and is a side to fly fishing that can bring you so much enjoyment. It is tricky, but rewarding, and the gear and terminology can bamboozle the most experienced piscator, but it can rapidly become an addiction. In this first part, we simply look at the gear needed to stick your toe in this wild water, review some of the basics of grip and stance, and also take a peek at the key casts you need to be successful in the Trout Spey world. So let's start this whole episode off with what is Trout Spey, first of all. Trout Spey is the terminology for a type of fly rod that has two handles, one below and one above the reel seat. So that's a double-handed rod, this upper one being quite long, this one lower. That's a Spey rod. And Trout Spey in particular is a rod that's between 10 and 12 foot in length and will take line sizes 1, 2, 3, or 4, maybe 5. That's more steelhead territory. So a Trout Spey is a two-handed, short two-handed rod for light lines. You may say, why would you Trout Spey? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, you have longer rods. Longer rods are good for longer casts. Longer rods are great when you have to make constant mends at range. So those longer rods do give you an advantage that short 8'6" and 9 foot rods might not do so. Trout Spey rods are fun. You can have a barrel of fun fishing and catch no fish. Believe it or not, you can. And the Spey cast that we're going to look through in this episode shows you ways of casting that are fun ways, challenging ways, and you actually don't have to catch a fish to enjoy your day out there. What Spey casts are, essentially, are a form of fly cast that doesn't have a back cast, so good for obstructions, trees behind you, people, bridges, whatever. And particularly, they're really good for angle changes. Like if my line's here and I want to cast it over here, I can do a thing called a Spey cast and change direction super quick. They're very, very efficient angle changing casts. And this kind of evolution of Trout Spey that is developed in the US and spreading out across the world actually has got a lot of steelhead and salmon anglers out on the water Spey casting. People who fish for steelhead and salmon love it. It's a wonderful, addictive way of fishing, but there's less and less fish. But now if you do the same swinging, Trout Spey, Spey casting up with these lighter outfits, and you're not catching salmon and steelhead, but you can catch 8, 10, or 20 trout a day, you can have a barrel of laughs fishing them. So a lot more people are going into Trout Spey from the Spey world. And I've used this term Spey a number of times, and let's give you a really tiny bit of history. What is Spey? Well, Spey is a river in Scotland where ostensibly in around 1860s, 1870s, Spey casting came from. And Spey casts are, as I just mentioned, fly casts that don't have a full back cast and change direction. So they're very, very useful casts to know. Now you may say, well, I do all that, Simon. I do that with my one-handed rod. Why would I want a longer two-handed rod? Well, number of reasons. Again, rod length, good for distance. Rod length, good for mending. Two hands, a lot of fun, very good on the shoulders. Instead of using a lot of shoulder casting like this with your on hand, you're going to use a lot of fulcrums and really keep your hand and casting strokes tight to you, so it becomes a lot less tiring. So there's a lot of benefits in these longer fly rods as long as you use them with two hands. One thing you can't do though, you can't fish your regular dry flies. Dry fly fishing with a Trout Spey outfit is probably about the only thing you can't do. You can fish nymphs and indicators and soft tackles and streamers and hopper droppers, but fishing a dry fly to a rising fish is probably about the only no, generally speaking. And while in many of our episodes we've talked about specialist gear for specialist types of fishing, and you could probably get away with your regular fly outfits for all the other episodes we've talked about, with Trout Spey, you need a radically different approach in gear. And that is what we'll talk about in the very next chapter. The first thing we're going to look at in gear are the rods. And as we said in the earlier chapter, the rods are longer and they're two-handed. So you've got these long grips up here, which is where one hand holds it, and you've got this short little grip down here, which is where your bottom hand's going to hold. And it's kind of a fulcrum little pivot type of casting technique, as we'll see later in this chapter. A couple of things to know about these rods. They are fly rods, right? So they work like a single-handed rod, but they're on a different standard, and that confuses a lot of people. For example, this is my favorite little Trout Spey wand. It's a 2-weight. Look at that, beautiful little 2-weight. And a lot of people will look at that and go, oh, 2-weights are a little bit too light for me. How do I equate that to a one-handed rod? And there's a rule of 3. And quite simply, you add number 3 to this rod to get this rod, the single-handed rod. So this 2-weight equates to a 5-weight one-handed rod. So it kind of makes sense. So that gives you a rough idea of how to choose the rod. If you fish a 5-weight one-handed rod and you want a similar kind of feel with your rod, get a 2-weight one of these. If you like the 6-weight rod because you fish streamers and bigger flies, get a 3-weight one of these. So that's a good rule of thumb for choosing rods. And perhaps the other really good rule of thumb on these is about the fish size. So if you double the rod size, like that 2-weight, double that as 4. So that's a 4-weight. Or if it's a 3-weight, double that's a 6. That means anything up to about 6 pounds, that rod is perfect for it. You don't need to overkill and get a 5-weight Trout Spey rod because you fish a 5-weight one-handed rod, and then you're catching 16, 18-inch fish. It's completely overkill. It's like using an 8-weight for little fish. So hopefully that gives you a rough idea of how to choose the rod, double the rod size for fish size, or add 3 to the line size to create a one-hander. I know, it's a really complicated subject, and boy, we haven't even started getting into the nitty-gritty of lines. Reels are a similar rule of thumb. This is a Trout Spey reel. This is just a regular reel, but if I turned on the back of this rod, this reel, and took a look at it, I would see it says 6, 7, 8. That's a single-handed rod size. So if I took a single-handed rod, a 6 or a 7, I would put this reel on it, but that also is the right rod for a 2 or 3-weight Trout Spey. Right? You add 3. 3-weight Trout Spey, 3 plus 3 is 6. 6-weight reel, beautiful. And the reason you want those bigger reels is the lines are quite a lot fatter. Fatter means it needs more capacity in the reel to hold it. And perhaps more important than that, it comes down to the balance. These rods, as I said in that earlier chapter, are 10 to 12 foot long. And that means they're longer, so they're a little bit more top heavy. That means they need a little bit more weight at the bottom end to counterbalance that. So you need heavier reels for your Trout Spey. So rule of thumb, add 3 for your Trout Spey rod to your one-handed, add 3 to your reel, and you're kind of on the right track of getting yourself set up with the most basic core of your gear. And then we go into fly lines. Well, fly lines can get really complicated in Spey world, but we're going to try and keep it really, really simple. This isn't an advanced video, this is just the basics. And really in the world of Spey, there are 2 types of fly line. There's a Spey line that is called a Skagit. It's this little pink thing here in this bag. That's a Skagit type line. And there's a Spey line type that's called a Scandi, and that's this straw color line in this bag. And I think that perhaps the best way to understand these lines is to look at 2 balls, a baseball and a table tennis ball. The Skagit's your baseball, and your table tennis ball, that's going to be your Scandi. And what you want to correlate that with is, first of all, which is going to be easier to throw? Probably this, probably a baseball. So a Skagit's the easiest line to cast. Which is going to have more power, which is going to hurt harder when it hits you? The Skagit line or the baseball. So your Skagit lines are your powerful lines, your heavy lines, your easy to cast lines. But if you had a fish rising and this lovely calm water and you threw that or this at that fish, this is less likely to scare it. So your Scandi is more your presentation style of line. And I'm going to use that analogy several times in this episode because it's kind of a good way of correlating that. And the last part of kind of confusion is when you look at these Spey lines, you can either set yourself up with what's called an integrated line. And this is an integrated line. What that means is this pink line, the Skagit, the baseball, that leads into this kind of grayish color line here and by the reel, the thin running line. But you'll see between the 2, there are no knots. That's called an integrated line. The head and the running line is all attached, just like a regular weight forward line. But in the Spey world, and the Trout Spey world too, there's also the shooting head system. And again, this is a similar outfit. I've got that same pink Skagit head here, and I've got a bit of blue on where the reel is, the running line, or it's also called the shooting line. But between the 2, there's a loop and a knot. It's not really a knot, it's a loop-to-loop connection. But that's a shooting head system. And the relevance of a shooting head system is that if you really get into Trout Spey, you're going to find yourself one day fishing a streamer. I'll talk about that in a minute. You have a Skagit head on, you're fishing away with this Skagit head because you need the Skagit head to cast the right fly. And as you work your way down the pool, you decide it's time to change your line. Well, with that shooting head system, you simply take this one off and loop this one on. That means you only need one reel, one shooting line, and you just keep these heads in your pocket. And as you fish your way down the pool, you can change head really, really easily without having to worry about carrying lots and lots of gear and buying lots and lots of gear. But the only downside with that is there is this loop-to-loop connection here, and that's going to go right between the rod rings. And sometimes when you strip that in, it goes tick, 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 up through the rod rings and goes as it shoots out. It can get snagged in there. If you're playing a fish, it gets a little bit frustrating. So there is a downside to that loop-to-loop system, but generally speaking, it's a better way to fish unless you only want to fish a Skagit, or if you only want to fish a Scandi. And then this integrated system is going to be far better because it doesn't have the loops. Okay, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, gives you kind of a starting point to understand these terms, Skagit and Scandi. In addition to the lines, you're going to put on some tips. You're going to do a little fishing with sink tips. You might fish an intermediate sink tip. You might fish a fast sinking tip. And this next part of this chapter is going to kind of relate all down to what fly you're fishing. So in this hand here, I have a tiny, tiny soft hackle, my little favorite. And in this hand, I have a very large, heavy streamer with an enormous cone on it. And everything I'm going to tell you now is going to be based on these. Really, you should choose everything from your fly backwards. The fly is the last product that's going to land there. You want the fly to cast to the fish. You want the fly to present nicely in the water. You want the fly to be fairly easy to cast. So everything back from the fly is designed to fit and make that fly cast. And what I'm saying by that is that when you choose a tip, you can either choose a level tip. Now, this is going to get complicated. I understand that, but let's see how we go with this. This tip is level. It means it doesn't get thinner at any end. There's no taper to it. It's called a T-tip or a MO tip, M-O-W. These tips are great. They're level. And the good thing about the level tip is because the tip is level, whatever weight it is at the back end, it's the same weight at the front end. That is the baseball. Right? That is a heavy tip. So that tip is a heavy tip. That will throw the heavy fly. That'll go on your Skagit, baseball, baseball, baseball. Kind of a nice setup. And then the other type of tip we can have, these tips are tapered tips. This is a Versa leader here. We'll talk about tips as we go through fishing techniques in a moment, but right now just giving you some background information. And this is a tapered tip. And with tapered tips, they are tapered, so the front end gets thin. That means the front end has the least amount of weight. So the front end of that is your table tennis ball. Perfect for casting those little soft hackles. So as you get through this system, you want to try and plan everything based on that fly. When you fish small, light flies, you want a nice light tip, a tapered tip. You want a nice light line, a Scandi type line, a presentation type of line. And the last part of that whole equation is also the leaders. When you fish light flies, you want generally a light, softer, more performing leader. This is just a regular Powerflex Plus leader. It's 9 foot long. I get that fly a nice long way away from the fly line. I don't spook the fish. It's a good presentation type thing. But when you fish a really big streamer, one of the greatest things to try and recall in fly fishing when you're setting up gear, mass moves mass. A streamer this heavy, I want the weight of this streamer as close as I can to the weight of the line. So in this situation, I'm going to fish a really short leader like this, 6 foot long, but medium stiff, a little bit stiffer than normal. So the stiffness of this leader helps cast the fly. This would never cast on that earlier leader. That leader is too soft and too long. So as I said, it is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to go into any real depth. I just want to give you some guidelines of choices and the words you'll hear in this Trout Spey world of Skagits and Scandis and MO tips, level tips, tapered tips, Versa leaders. It is a bit of a minefield. We'll see more of that as we go through some rigging. But right now, well, that is really the basic gear you need. You don't need much more than that. You just need to understand how to choose your rod, how to balance it with a reel, those basic types of lines, and that's about it. And once you've got the gear, you kind of need to know how to cast it. And we're going to take a look at some of those casts that you use with Trout Spey in the very next chapter. So let's take a look at some of the casts you utilize with a two-handed Trout Spey outfit. Just for reference sake, this is a little three-weight Trout Spey. I love this three-weight and the two-weight. They're my favorite Trout Spey rods. So I'm always going to pick this one or the two-weight when I want to demonstrate anything because it's just too much fun. On the end here, I've got the integrated Scandi we just talked about. I like the integrated because I don't like the loops going in my rod rings. And I love that Scandi taper because I like the way it lands and cast. It's a very efficient, beautiful line to cast. And on the front end, I've got a little 10-foot tapered tip just to finish off what I call a sublime setup. So that's what I've got. Now, when you get into this Trout Spey game, maybe the first time you pick up a two-handed rod, you might look at it and go, not sure what to do. Like, do I hold it like a sword with double-handed like that? So there's a couple of tips. One, the top hand that's controlling the rod is always going to hold where the balance is. So kind of find where the rod balances on your finger. And that is where you're going to wrap the grip of your top hand around that balance point. It makes it so easy to move the rod with the bottom hand, which is what you are going to do a lot of by holding the balance point. Don't hold the rod away from the balance because you can see the rod is just constantly trying to fall. You're fighting now. So holding the balance point with the top hand, essential. Grip is loose. Here's the other grip, below the reel. A lot of people try and grab it here the first few times until they get shouted at, so don't do that. You want to grab around here. You can utilize a grip that holds the whole of the bottom handle, or you can utilize a little grip like this, so it's called a ring grip. It doesn't matter. That's just a style thing. Just hold the rod loosely with both hands, nice and comfortable, and that's a good grip. And the other basic thing we should look at is the stance, and the stance is no different for you throwing a tennis ball, a cricket ball, a stone. If I want to throw a stone with my right hand, I'll plant my left foot forward here and chuck it. Great. If I want to throw it left-handed, I'll plant my right foot forward and chuck it. And so when casting, I want to do the same thing. I want to know what my target is. If I'm going to cast with my right hand, I'll stand with my left leg aligned towards that target. Nice stance there. And if I'm going to cast off my left side, I'm going to change my stance and have my right foot aligned. So a little thing of grip and stance. Once you've got your grip and stance dialed in, well, there's a bunch of casts you could utilize with this Trout Spey rod. You could certainly do your overhead cast. If you've got no things behind you, no bushes, trees, or people, absolutely knock yourself out and go an overhead cast. You probably overhead cast a lot of times the one-handed rod, so your timing and your rhythm and your accelerations are good. So that's a good starting point. But sometimes you're going to fish in rivers and there's trees and banks and bushes behind you and you can't do a back cast because of that. So the roll cast is another very useful cast. It's actually a great foundation builder. You should really hone a good roll cast before you move into the Trout Spey casts themselves. And while those two casts are the essential basics, they don't really work in a river very well because they don't change direction. And when you change direction, your line starts at A and you want to cast at B, you've got to move beyond those basic casts. And that's where you get into the casts that are true Spey casts. The double Spey, called the double Spey because there's one movement, two movements, and then a forward stroke. Beautiful looking cast, very classic old cast from the 1800s, so a traditional old cast. There's a cast called a snap T. Snap T is a more vigorous cast. It still has two movements before the forward stroke. It's a much more modern cast, but it's a good cast to utilize and a fairly easy one to learn. And a little bit more difficult to learn is a cast called a snake roll, a glorious, magnificent looking, sexy cast you look at and go, wow, how does anyone make a line move like that? It's a beautiful cast to watch. It's an incredibly efficient cast, but technically it's a little more difficult to learn. And then there's one other cast called the single Spey. Single Spey, a single movement, then a forward stroke, another flowing, beautiful, efficient, effortless cast. But again, another cast that's a little bit more difficult to learn. So in this episode, we're not actually going to concentrate on the snake roll or the single Spey. What we're going to do is look at more important casts, more useful casts, more easy to learn casts, the roll cast, the double Speys, and the snap Ts. So with that note, let's get out, get some line out, and show you how to do some of those basic Trout Spey casts. The first cast we're going to take a look at is the foundation cast, the grandpa, the founding member family of Family Spey, the roll cast. This is an essential cast to get right before you go on to your Spey cast, because if you have a bad roll cast, you're not going to get a good Spey cast. So let's start right here and dial in a good roll cast, then that'll prep you for the good Spey casts. One thing that's going to apply to every Spey cast we talk about is how much line is hanging outside the rod. And you can see the tip of the rod here, I have a blue bit of line hanging out. That means the fat bit, the head, is outside the rod, and the thin bit, the running line's inside the rod. So when you're practicing your Spey casts and your roll casts, always make sure you set yourself up for success and have that little color change right at the tip of the rod, and your rod's going to load the best as a result. It's a cast that hasn't got a back cast, so it's a very good cast with trees behind you, which is why you tend to do it, but it's pretty stodgy. It's not really, it's grandpa, it's a pretty stodgy old cast. It's not really dynamic, so it's no more use than really building up a good foundation to get into the Spey cast. But if you can understand this cast, the world opens up. So what is a roll cast? Well, first of all, let's just take a look at a couple of roll casts. Let's look at a good roll cast. What it should do, a good roll cast unrolls, the line unrolls in the air, you have a nice tight little narrow loop, and then your line and leader and fly all pitch and drop together as one. So a good roll cast unrolls in the air, nice loop, everything lands as one. That's what you're trying to achieve, a good forward roll cast. What you don't want is to think of the word roll, and you don't want your line rolling along the water like that. That's a bad roll cast. The fly landed last. That's not good for fishing. You also don't want a roll cast that climbs really high in the air and falls in a fluttering mess on the water. So understand what a good roll cast looks like. Perfect loop, unrolling, parallel to the water, pitch, turn over, drop onto the water. Let's look at some terminology. This applies to all Spey casts. There might be a dozen Spey casts you could do with this, but again, everything's going to come from this foundation of the roll cast. And quite simply, I want to give you 4 terms to think about. 1, what is called the anchor. The anchor is the piece of fly line from the fly all the way to where the hanging line touches the water. In other words, the line on the water, that is called the anchor. The second thing I'd like you to be aware of is where the line hanging down touches the water. That touching point, the very tiny little riplet you get from that, is called point P. The line curving behind the rod in a beautiful little sagging curve is called the D loop. Very essential. And then the last thing I want to give you is what's called the train tracks. And the train tracks is a concept that helps you cast. And you imagine 2 train tracks, they're parallel lines, right? Lying on a bit of paper or on the ground, whatever they are, they're just train tracks. What train tracks are, in terms of Spey casting, is that you have one train track that's lying on the water, and your forward stroke is always parallel and close to that one. As long as you make that forward cast close and parallel, you have train tracks. You always want to understand that. More on that in a moment. Here's my line facing this way, so my forward stroke is close and parallel, creating 2 parallel tracks. Make sense? Train tracks, wonderful. Let's come back to that. Before we come back to that, let's go back 1 step and talk about the forward stroke, because the forward stroke is where almost everyone goes wrong when they pick up a 2-handed rod the first time and grab it in this bottom hand. And a lot of people keep this bottom hand as the pivot point, and they kind of just drive the top hand over the pivot point, and the bottom hand really does not much. This is a really poor forward stroke. You're pivoting over, the top hand is doing all the work, not what you should be doing. When you're trying to dial in a forward stroke, what you're trying to do is trying to drive with the top hand, and then the top hand stops driving, and then the bottom hand is going to come in and close what is called the wedge. There's a little wedge shape here. You see I drive, I retain a wedge, I stop driving, and now all that happens is this bottom hand snaps the rod back to the elbow, closing the wedge. Let's just show you that in full speed correctly. Drive, snap the wedge over, and you can see it's the bottom hand snapping. Show you one more time the correct version. Drive, snap. What a lovely loop. See how nice that is? Now if you pivot and just drive the top hand over, the top hand is doing all the work. You're not loading the rod in any way. Your loop is enormous. You can drive a bus through the size of that loop. It falls in the water in a big mess. It's ineffective. So one of the earliest things you can do is practice and hone your forward stroke. And best way of doing that really is forget about the rod and the line. Just get the butt section of the rod and literally try and practice this loading move unload move. See that little snap at the end? Start slow, finish fast. 4 good letters. Slow, fast. Very good stroke. Slow, fast. Oh yeah, that's what you're trying to achieve. So start slow, finish fast, load the rod, unload the rod. Magic. It'll take a little bit of practice. And one of the things I strongly urge you to do, and you'll see why when we look at the actual rest of the Spey cast, is I strongly urge you to practice this roll cast with your dominant hand, which is my right hand in this case. There's my train track. I would strongly urge you practice straight down the river, not across the river. Go face straight down the current. Practice that parallel to the train track. Yeah, that was a nice one. Drag it back. Parallel to the train track, that's a nice one. And then switch hands and practice the same thing off your non-dominant side. Because Spey casters, as you'll see shortly, you have to cast from both sides of your body. You can switch hands, do the same practice stroke, or you can go what's called cat-handed and keep your non-dominant hand but cast off the other side of your body. That's another skill you can have. So learn to cast off both sides, dial your forward stroke in. And what's so significant about these things? Well, first of all, the D-loop is your friend. Think of it as your buddy in a bar fight. The bigger he is, the better your chance of coming out of the night with your life. So when you make a cast like a roll cast, if you have a very small D-loop, hardly behind the rod, there's not a lot of load. The D-loop is what makes the rod flex back. So when you've got a small D-loop, there's not a lot of load. It's not really a lot of mass to make the rod work, so you're going to do a lot of work. So the first thing on D-loops is try and make sure the D-loop is big enough, pushed a little bit further behind you, a little more weight behind you. Get a much more effortless forward stroke because you've got this big friend behind you bending that rod and giving you some load. And then the other part to understand is this point P we talked about. When you make a forward stroke, it's essential that point P is level or in front of where you're wading. Level or in front. If you get that right, the line leaves the water silently, cleanly. But if point P is behind you, slightly when you go forward, the line has this slurping sound, there's this big spray, the line loses all its energy, all because the line is on the water behind me. So really focus on all your casts of getting to this position, point P hanging, following that point P and following that track. Keep point P in front. And talking of tracks, here's one of the most obvious mistakes you can make. If my train track is facing down here, to Paris, why not? And I want to go to Rome, because there's a fish in Rome, there's no fish in Paris, I want to go to Rome. If I try and make a roll cast to Rome here, it can't work, because my train's facing Paris. So the essence of Spey casting, which is what we're getting to, is that you're going to move your train track to where you want to go, Rome, and then finish with a roll cast. So I could do this, flop it, there's my line, it's now facing Rome, and I can make a perfect finishing roll cast. And that is what the essence of Spey casting is. So master your roll cast, get your forward stroke dialed in, and then understand that all your Spey casts are just simply different ways of moving your train track. So if you've got your forward stroke dialed and you understand the concept of moving the track to where you want to go, you can now evolve from grandpa roll into all these beautiful Spey casts that one can do with the Trout Spey rod. There's actually something like a dozen Spey casts you could do, but we're going to look at 2. With these 2 casts done with both hands, you can fish in any pool with any line in any situation. So this is like the lowest level to get to, is to know these 2 casts, which will set you up for all your future Trout Spey world. And then you can get into some more technical, advanced, fancy schmancy casts. But let's look at these basic ones. And the first one we're going to look at is a cast called a double Spey. Double because there's 2 moves before a forward stroke. What we want to work out is, why do you use a double Spey? And think of the letter D, because it begins with a D for double Spey. And the double Spey has a lot of letter Ds. First of all, I want you to look at the river. And when your river's flowing in a certain direction, the land on your right side, as you look downriver, That's called the right bank or river right. The land on the left side is called the left bank or river left. That's important you understand that, and you'll see why as we go through this video. The double spey, the letter D's we talked about the double spey, is you're going to always use, for the double spey, your downstream arm. So as I face across the river, my right arm is my downstream arm, so this is my double spey arm. If I'm on that side, the left side of the river, facing this way, my left arm is my downstream arm, so I'm going to make a left-handed cast or a cat-handed cast for double spey. So double spey used with a downstream arm. You always use the double spey when there's a downstream blowing wind or no wind. The wind's blowing downriver. This is a very safe cast. And the last D you have to remember is that the anchor, we talked about the anchor being the line on the water, that is always on your downstream side of your body. So remember the letter D's, that kind of tells you everything. Double spey, downstream wind, use your downstream arm, keep your anchor on your downstream side. Let's just take a look at a double spey. This is what it looks like. I'm going to do one move called the setup stroke. I'm going to do another loop called the D-loop stroke, and then I make my forward stroke, the third move after those. That's a double spey. Very easy, very efficient cast, nice to see. And if you can understand those concepts we talked about in that little chapter before, the roll cast, and you have a good forward stroke, and you follow your track, you can live on this, you can live by this being what's called a spey ambassador. Spey ambassador is somebody who never makes a bad spey cast. It's a great thing to be, and if you understand spey casting, you can actually make every spey cast work because you follow your track. So, I'm going to swing this nice pool for a fish. My line's going to end up down here at Paris because that's where the swing ends. And I want to put my line right back across the river to Rome to get that sweep and that swing. So I have to somehow move my track from where it is now to here. And this cast, the double spey, is how you do it with the downstream wind. The first move is called the setup stroke. And the setup stroke, the rod starts motionless, raised to about a 2 o'clock angle if you're looking at a clock face, and just there still. The line is downriver. The first move, I'm going to sweep the rod tip over my body and stop it about 1 foot from the water, pointing upstream. That's it. Start high at 2 o'clock. Sweep over your hat, down to 1 foot. That's the move. What you're trying to do with that move, that's a little bit more complex. Let's just show you what you're trying to do. You can either imagine or you can just do what I'm going to do here. You can wrap the line around your rod. And if you point your rod straight down the river and splash on the water and draw a line from that splash to you, and then point your rod straight in front of you and splash and continue that line from you to that splash, you get a right angle. And I want you to continue that imaginary right angle to an imaginary square, the box. You can call it box or square, but there's a square on the water. Can you kind of comprehend that, picture that? So what you're trying to do on the double spey is the very end of my fly line is attached to a leader. And there's a loop-to-loop join between my leader and my fly line. The junction between the loop-to-loop, the leader and the fly line. Why is that important? Well, because what you're trying to do. On this first stage, you are trying to judge it. So when you finish the first stage, the junction lands in the square. That's what you're trying to do. Doesn't matter about much else. You're just trying to land the junction in the square. If it's in the square, your cast is set up perfectly. It takes practice. Of course it takes practice. You might go a little bit too hasty on this first stage and the fly line junction goes way past the square. That's never going to work. In fact, that's going to be dangerous because you're going to hook yourself. You might also be too slow. You might be just, okay, I'm really scared of hitting myself, so I'm very slow here. And your junction is so far below the square that when you come round to form your forward stroke ready, your train track is at Paris still. It hasn't come up here, it hasn't aligned with the target. So a cast over here cannot work. So the object of this first stage, start the rod nice and high and still, sweep it down to 1 foot, you just land that loop in the square. Practice, practice, practice. When you get good at landing the loop in the square with this nice low rod a foot from the water, I think you can tick that box. Hey, I've mastered the setup stroke. Now the next stroke, it's called the D-loop stroke. It has 2 functions. One is to create a D-loop. Remember our friend in the bar, big friend, so big D-loop. So one of them is to create a D-loop. It's got to be right opposite Rome, remember? Right opposite here, because that's where I'm going, so I have to load the rod that way. So I'm trying to create a D-loop this way, but equally, I'm also trying to turn the fly line, the train track from Paris to Rome. Because when I finish stage 1, you'll note that all your line faces straight down the river, faces that way. But the second move, this D-loop stroke, if you get it right, when you come around here, you now align the line to Rome. So the second point of that move is to align your target to whatever your target is. Create a D-loop and align and set up the target. So high rod, sweep it over your head, drop it in the box, sweep round, lift up to the key position, beautiful track facing Rome, and then you're just going to finish off with the forward stroke, which you've dialed in from that roll cast practice. Roll cast practice, roll cast practice. Get a good forward stroke. Let's take a look at that whole thing, all in a beautiful flow. High rod and still. Sweep over, down low. Sweep round up to the key position, make a pause, drive your forward stroke out. That's a double spey. 2 simple moves followed by your forward stroke. And as I said, if you can understand what each move is trying to do, comprehension is vital to improvement. You can become better and better because you're understanding what each stroke is trying to do. A couple of things to avoid. One is as you come round, if you go round too slowly, you leave a tail in the line. That tail is called a bloody L. The track isn't facing Rome. Part faced Rome, part faced Paris. So I do need just enough speed in this stroke here to turn all the fly line to face Rome. Just enough. That's a good part. And like anything, you can be too slow, but equally you can be too fast. And I want to introduce you to something I don't want you to do. It's called a blown anchor. What that term means, if you remember, the anchor is the line on the water when you start the forward stroke. A blown anchor means you've done something to lift the line out of the water and blown it off the water, like this. Land, come around too fast, the line is now gone. It's out of the square, it's hanging in the tree behind you, you've got to go and unhook it. So a blown anchor is literally just too much speed. You need to judge the speed to avoid the bloody L and the blown anchor and just straighten the track so it faces Rome, and you add your forward stroke, and that's what a double spey is. So as I said, the double spey is a great cast to utilize. It's the first cast I recommend you learn after the roll cast with the Trout Spey rod. It's the easiest one to learn. Remember, if you're on the right side of the river, you want to learn it with your right hand, your downstream hand. If you're on the left side of the river, you want to learn it with your left hand, or equally you can learn it cack-handed style, where you're crossing your body, but you do need it on your downstream side. Double spey, downstream side. And that's it. In a nutshell, big nutshell, that's the double spey. That's the essence of the double spey. As I said, get your forward stroke right, follow your train track, and if you know these moves, what you're trying to achieve, it's not hard to make a great double spey and a great cast to use in the downstream wind. So all we need to do now is take a look at a cast for when the wind blows upriver. Because imagine the wind's blowing this way now, strong, and I do a double spey, and I come around here, and there's this huge puff of wind. Woo, woo. That fly is going to blow into you. So when the wind blows upriver, then you need another cast. That cast is a snap tee, and we're going to take a look at that in the very next chapter. The other cast, the snap tee, we're going to take a look from the left side of the river. I still want to teach you these casts right-handed, so I've come to the other side of the river so you can kind of work them out right-handed. And if you're left-handed, I'm sorry, we're just doing it the right-handed way. But we'll do some stuff on the other side to give you a clue of how to do it. The double spey, if you remember, was a cast that you did with all the letter Ds. Downstream wind, downstream arm, anchor on your downstream side. So conversely, the snap T is the exact opposite. You do the snap T when the wind goes upriver. You're going to use your upriver arm, which in this case is my right arm, and I want my anchor on my upriver side. With the double spey, if you remember, we started by drawing a box on the downstream side. Well, I don't want my anchor on the downstream side in this cast. I want my anchor on the upstream side. So your box, same concept, rod upstream, rod in front, little splashes. Here's the box, it's on my upstream side. So I'm trying to land my line tip in the box on the upstream side. Otherwise, this cast is pretty similar to the double spey. It's got two moves before the forward stroke. It's got the D-loop stroke. It's got that set-up stroke, and the set-up stroke's trying to land it in the box. The only real difference between these two, apart from the side of the river you do it on and the wind you do it on, is how you do your set-up stroke. With the double spey, we did that high rod sweeping over your head down low. With this, we're going to draw a letter. Imagine this rod is a gigantic bit of chalk. And I've got a huge blackboard right here. And I put my bit of chalk on the blackboard, and I'm going to draw a straight line up the blackboard to the top of the blackboard and draw an enormous curve. So a capital, from my point of view, a capital letter D. That is the shape, a D, straight up, round. Can you picture that? That's the D. So that's the shape, up and round. And this cast is called a snap T because there's a snap in it. So the only difference between what I just drew and what I'm going to do in reality is look where I put some speed in. I do a little zip, a little undercutted zip. I use an analogy of somebody chopping a burger in half, but not through the bun, through the burger. Think of it, you've got your two buns, your burger in the middle, so you come up with your knife and you want to cut right through the burger, not down the bun. So that's where your speed is. Your speed is on a horizontal stroke. And really, if you have that move, and you have your line tight to start off with, and you have that lift and snap, when you finish that first letter D with a cutting the burger snap, up, high, round, snap, the line tip jumps out of the water from here and lands upstream of you, hopefully in the box. That's your objective, this box here. Show you again. Nice low rod. Always start with a low rod. Always start with your line straight down river. Slow, straight lift, nice and high. I'm not going to pause in reality. I'm pausing just to talk to you. The top of the lift, curve, snap. And that snap is what makes the line jump out and land the line there. And you'll practice. Like the double spey, you're going to go too far upriver, not far enough upriver. So if you snap the line way up here and it's way upstream of the box, when you go forward, your train track is not facing the target, which is across there. The train track's got to face across there. If I do a pathetic weak thing and the snap lands down there, nowhere near the box again, the line's across me, it's just not set up correctly. So I'm trying to lift, snap and sweep. There it is in the box. That's the completion of the snap T cast. So as I said, the snap T, it's an upstream wind, upstream cast, upstream anchor. You're going to do that set-up stroke, let the line wash down, lift up high, pause, round, little snap, watch it land. As soon as it lands, you then get into the D-loop stroke. And the D-loop stroke, just like on the double spey, has two purposes. One, create a D-loop right opposite the target. I'm going to call it London this time. There's London. Paris is still down here, here's London. So when I do my set-up stroke, I want to land my line in the box. And that D-loop stroke, I want to turn the line to face London. But I also want my D-loop to be exactly opposite London. And that does take a shift of the body. What I mean by that is if you stand facing downriver, which a lot of people do, and they do this stroke, they can't turn their body enough to bring this rod around opposite London. For me to be in a good casting position to cast across there, I want my rod rotated so that it's back in that plane. And to that extent, that's why it's said right at the beginning of this episode about the stance. That's why it's so important to have this stance with my left foot forward. So I can do this move, and I sweep it round, turn my rod's beautifully opposite London, and I can make that forward stroke right down the train tracks. That's the concept. Not hard. Nice, easy concept. Again, try and practice each stage to master each stage before you really get happy putting it all together. Let's take a look at that whole thing. Rods low. Double Spey started high. Snap T starts low. Come up, high, round, little snap. Sweep round to the key position opposite my target. Make that forward stroke that you've practiced again and again and again with your roll cast. So as I said, that's a cast called a snap T. And one thing I think is really worth keeping in mind is there's a rhythm to this cast. And the rhythm is like a double spade. They both have the rhythm of a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Right, that's the tempo this cast should be. So if I start counting and go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You see how slow and rhythmical it is? It's just all too easy to try everything without pauses and everything just goes rush. There is not a lot of rush. You snap, go 1, 2, 3, sweep round 1, 2, 3, over. Just build up that lovely rhythm. And really, that's the snap T. As I said, there's not much difference between that and the double spade because the setup stroke and D-loop stroke have the same goals. The forward stroke, you should have got it dialed in. But just like the double spade, let me give you 2 warnings. The correct tempo of this sweep on the D-loop stroke. If I sweep too slowly, I'm left with the bloody L, the kink in the line. So I don't have a track facing the target. You do want to make sure you have just enough inertia so all your line turns and faces London. And just like the double spade, you can go a little too hastily and blow the anchor, which looks like this. A little too fast, see the line's lifted, it's hanging in the tree behind me, no good. So I need to keep the tempo just enough, that waltz tempo is perfect to keep the line on the water and to stay in the box. And again, if you're a righty, I would suggest coming onto this left side of the river and learning it and practicing right-handed because that's your dominant hand. But someday you are going to be on that other side of the river, the right side of the river. You're going to have a wind blowing upstream. Your upstream arm is your left arm. So your snap T is going to be a left-handed or a cack-handed snap T from that side of the river. So you do want to make sure you practice your casts, both double spades and snap Ts from both sides of the river. And if you can do that, if you get those 2 casts dialed in from both sides of the river by changing hands, you're set. You have every tool in the casting box that you need to succeed as a trout spey caster. And that is something very special. So there you have it, an introduction to the trout spey world. Hopefully this episode has given you an inkling of the basic gear you need. It's helped you figure out how to hold one of those long sticks and give you an idea of some of the wonderful casts that are so much fun and so useful to know. As I said at the beginning, this is the first episode in a 2-part mini-series on trout spey. And in the next episode, I'm going to show you some of the basic rigs you would use with these trout spey rods and how and where you'd fish them to maximize your chance of success on the water. So make sure you check out the next episode and come and finish your trout spey education.